Hi, and welcome to RAVE Leader Chat, Week 8 in the Gospel of Mark, focusing on chapter 6, verses 52 through all of chapter 7. There's really two dominant themes in this week's passage, and that's the role of tradition and the meaning of uncleanliness, or the source of uncleanliness. And really, in some way, shape, or form, every section in this larger passage really fits into that. So let's kind of walk through a brief outline with some points. We start with the end of chapter 6, verses 53 to 56. You have Jesus returning to a city that he's been to before and healing lots of people. And sort of implied there is two things: that his healing ministry is continued, but also that he's having contact with unclean people. He's with the masses. And then by comparison, as we move to chapter 7, we have the arrival of the Pharisees and scribes again, and they have a couple issues, and both of those issues are enumerated in verse 5 as they ask about, don't you observe the tradition of hand washing because it responds to uncleanliness? Well, a couple things are revealed there. One is that the role of tradition and the expansion of tradition. When Moses was first given the Ten Commandments and even some of the expansive law in the Old Testament, the Pharisees had sort of taken that and perfected it. It's called here the tradition of the elders, or by the end of that conversation, your tradition. But it really was an expansion, and it starts out faithful. How do we best live this out? And it really became very legalistic and so expansive that it sometimes lost its touch point with where it started in God's Word. And that really becomes the larger challenge is, are you obeying the tradition of the elders or your tradition versus God's Word? And so there's a light discussion of what some of those areas are at the beginning of chapter 7, and then there's the specific discussion of Korban. And really the best way to understand that is it was sort of deferred giving. Something was committed to God, but not turned over yet. And the example that's given is that you might have a property that could be utilized to benefit your parents. You're called in the Old Testament to honor your parents. But because you've marked it as Korban, because it was set aside for godly purpose eventually, it could no longer be a blessing to your parents. And that's really what Jesus is kind of highlighting, how the tradition sort of takes over. And actually, by Jesus' day, if you place something in Korban, you actually had to buy it out with a fee to get it unmarked in that regard. So great conversation. I want to highlight question 3 in the study guide about the role of tradition for us. This is a challenge for every generation as we take God's Word and we begin to enculturate it a little bit with our practices and our understanding. A great question for us to consider is, how does tradition play a role in our hearts and lives, and even in our church? We move to the next section where Jesus talks specifically about the source of uncleanliness. Really holds two different conversations, one with the sort of a larger crowd and then one with the disciples. But what he really does here is he first and gives them the strong command to listen, and that's code in Mark. He uses it 9 times, and that whatever is going to take place next is significant. It's emphatic. Listen to what I'm about to say. And then what he really says is that you've got the whole direction of uncleanliness all wrong. It's not things outside that come in that make us unclean. It's really what starts in that comes out that makes us unclean. And so there's great discussion there. That he ends with a list of sort of 12 things. They really can be broken down, some suggest, into 2 categories. The first 6 are all in the plural, and so they refer to specific acts that we would do. But the last 6 appear in the singular, and they sort of respond to mindsets or attitudes that we really purvey. And it's a great discussion of where that fits for us. And again, here, question number 5, how we sometimes get caught up dressing the outside and not taking care of the internal struggle and the battle of our hearts, if you will. So good conversation there. In 24 through 30, we actually go to Tyre, which was a city that was kind of close enough that people would have been exposed to it or would know about it, but it's a very pagan town, really, for our reading. It's a place full of unclean people. And in there, we have one of the most interesting and for some awkward conversations with Jesus. Jesus meets the Syrophoenician woman, and she comes asking for healing for her daughter. And Jesus has this awkward conversation about whether the food is for the children or for the dogs. Well, a couple things there. First, the word dog in the original Greek is more diminutive. It really means more the house pet. So someone that's part of the family and is fed, but isn't maybe on the same par with the family, as opposed to mongrel, which was kind of the other derogatory use of dog back in Jesus' day. But really, the question that Jesus is posing, and the question that we need to consider, is sort of, did Jesus come for the children of Israel, or for the dogs, the Gentiles? And we know that the answer is both, but Jesus, notice he does say that there is a prioritization. He first came to the people of Israel. He came for the Jewish people that they might discover their Messiah, but also he came for the Gentiles. And so the woman displays great faith in hanging in the conversation. Notice she doesn't refute Jesus' prioritized order of who he came for or where the good news is supposed to get to, but really sort of adapts it and says, but yes, even the dog gets fed. And really the word that she uses there is gets to eat all that he needs or all that he wants. And so she displays greater understanding about the scope of Jesus' ministry than clearly the scribes or the Pharisees, and clearly most of the people of Israel. She understands the expansive nature that Jesus came for Jew and Gentile alike. But again, this falls under that whole backdrop of he's engaging with somebody who's unclean. That brings us to the last section, 31 through 37. This passage is unique to Mark. It does not appear in the other three Gospels. It's a double healing of a man, and it has a little Old Testament background. You may want to read up on Isaiah 35, verses 5 and 6, the word for man who couldn't speak, or we used to use the word dumb, really ties into that passage about sort of what the Messiah is going to do and how he's going to do it. But notice that Jesus, he technically heals by his word. He speaks that unique word of ephatheth, and be opened, and his eyes were open. But there's also a very intentional touch, and I love question 10. That's a great one for you guys to wrestle with. Why does he touch when he clearly doesn't have to touch? And so there's a lot of good material in this passage this week. I want to thank you once again for your leadership, your preparation. I know that each week, two things. One is that you end up doing more work than your group does, but you also end up getting more blessing than your group does. That's the blessing of preparing for Bible study, is you can't possibly share everything that you discern. And that's a good reminder to make sure that you allow your groups to have some time for God's word to work in them and for them to answer. I know one of the challenges for me as a Bible study leader and teacher is that I want to blurt out the answer, but there's just great value in letting people wrestle with it and kick out their understanding, their answer, and have some discussion before maybe we give the more researched answer. And last, I want to just remind you that we are pursuing well-rounded discipleship. We have 6 different marks of discipleship. We want to raise up people who worship, who search the scriptures, who are growing in prayer, who love one another, who reach out with God's love and mission, and who reach out with the good news of the gospel for salvation. And I want to just hold those up in front of you. And one of the things that I was reminded of this week is that this is a very long 20-week RAVE group setting. Well, we really have the opportunity to maybe challenge ourselves to do 2, maybe even 3 mission opportunities, reaching out with God's love. So I want to challenge your group to start to think of one that we could do maybe before Easter gets here. Doesn't have to be huge, but some way. And as we kick around, some of those can come from our serve team as they brainstorm some different ways. But really another way to do it would be for you guys to talk about the things that are on your hearts, and maybe everybody rally around that one person and their passion to be able to make a difference with God's love in that way. So thanks again for your consistent leadership. Know that I'm praying for you and for your groups, and know that God's word never returns void. It always goes out and does its work. So the weight is not on you. You're called to open a space. You're called to tend a conversation. You're called to guide these questions. But God is really doing the work of writing his word on people's hearts. Thanks so much, and God bless.